Have you ever wondered what happened to one of the most fascinating women in biblical history after she seemingly vanished from the pages of Scripture? I'm talking about Zipporah, the wife of Moses, a woman whose story is shrouded in mystery and whose fate remains one of the Bible's most intriguing unsolved puzzles. She appears in dramatic moments, saves her husband's life in a supernatural encounter, yet after the exodus from Egypt, she disappears from the narrative entirely. Why does Scripture fall silent about the woman who stood beside the greatest leader in Hebrew history? Here's what most people don't realize. Zipporah wasn't just any ordinary wife. She was a Midianite princess, a foreign woman who married into the covenant family, and her story holds secrets that challenge everything we think we know about the early days of Israel. Her disappearance from the biblical record isn't just a gap in the text. It's a mystery that has puzzled scholars, theologians, and curious minds for thousands of years. What really happened to her after the Exodus? Did she die in the wilderness? Did she return to her homeland? Or is there something far more profound hidden in the silence of Scripture? The answers to these questions reveal not just the fate of one woman, but they unlock deeper truths about faith, identity, and what it means to be chosen by God in ways we never expected. And I can tell you right now, what you're about to discover will completely change how you see the story of Moses and the early formation of the people of Israel. If you're ready to dive deep into this biblical mystery, drop a 777 in the comments, and let's uncover the untold fate of Zipporah together. Trust me, this journey is going to take you places you never imagined. Let's begin at the very beginning, because to understand Zipporah's mysterious disappearance, we first need to understand who she really was and how extraordinary her entry into Moses' life truly becomes when we examine it closely. This isn't just a love story, it's a divine orchestration that would reshape the destiny of nations. Picture this scene. A young man flees Egypt after killing an Egyptian taskmaster in defense of a Hebrew slave. He's running for his life, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his actions. Moses, the adopted son of Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the splendor of Egyptian palaces, now finds himself a fugitive, wandering in the harsh wilderness of the Sinai Peninsula. He had grown up with every privilege Egypt could offer, educated in the wisdom of the ancient world, yet now he was homeless, penniless, and completely alone. After days of difficult travel, exhausted and thirsty, Moses arrives at a well near the land of Midian. This wasn't just any well, this was one of those ancient gathering places where communities came together, where news was shared, where life happened. And it was there, in what seemed like a chance encounter, that Moses would meet the woman who would change everything about his future. But before we meet her, we need to understand something crucial about her background. Zipporah wasn't just a shepherd girl drawing water. She was the daughter of Jethro, also called Reuel in some passages, who was a priest of Midian. This detail matters more than most people realize because it tells us she came from a family of religious significance, a family that understood spiritual authority and divine calling. Her father wasn't just any tribal leader. He was a man who served as a bridge between the human and the divine in his community. The Midianites themselves were descendants of Abraham through his wife Keturah, making them distant relatives of the Israelites. They weren't pagans worshipping foreign gods entirely removed from the knowledge of the one true God. Instead, they carried within their culture echoes of the same covenant promises that would later define the Hebrew people. Zipporah grew up in a household that honored the God of Abraham, even if their practices had evolved differently over the centuries. Now here's where the story gets interesting. When Moses arrived at that well, he witnessed something that revealed his character in a way that would prove prophetic for his future role as Israel's deliverer. 7 sisters, including Zipporah, had come to water their father's flocks, but local shepherds were harassing them, trying to drive them away so their own animals could drink first. These men were bullying these women, using their physical strength to intimidate and push them aside. Moses could have minded his own business. He could have stayed in the shadows, avoided conflict, and simply waited his turn. After all, he was already a fugitive, already in trouble, already facing an uncertain future. The last thing he needed was more confrontation. But something rose up within him, something that wouldn't let injustice stand unchallenged. He stood up to those shepherds, drove them away, and helped the women water their flocks. This wasn't just an act of chivalry. It was a glimpse into the heart of a man God was preparing to confront the mightiest empire on earth. The same spirit that moved Moses to defend these women at a well would later compel him to stand before Pharaoh and demand the freedom of an entire enslaved nation. In that moment by the well, Zipporah was seeing the character of the man who would become the greatest deliverer in human history. When the sisters returned home earlier than usual, their father Jethro immediately noticed something was different. These women typically spent much longer at the well, dealing with the harassment and competition from other shepherds. But today they came home quickly, with their flocks properly watered, and they had a story to tell. An Egyptian, they said, had helped them. They described him as a man who stood up to the local bullies and even drew water for their animals. Here's what strikes me as remarkable about Jethro's response. He didn't just thank Moses or offer him a meal. Instead, he immediately invited this stranger to stay, to become part of the household, to make their home his home. Why would a priest of Midian, a man of standing in his community, so quickly embrace a foreign fugitive? I believe Jethro recognized something in Moses that went beyond the surface, something that suggested divine purpose was at work. And Moses stayed, not for a few days or weeks, but for what appears to be several years. He became a shepherd, learning to navigate the wilderness that would later become the stage for Israel's 40-year journey. He learned to read the desert, to find water and pasture, to survive in conditions that would have killed most men raised in Egyptian luxury. Every skill he developed during those years in Midian was preparation for the massive responsibility that awaited him. During this time, Moses and Zipporah fell in love. But this wasn't just a romance. It was a partnership that would be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Zipporah chose to bind her life to a man who had no country, no people, no prospects, and no apparent future beyond tending sheep in the wilderness. What did she see in him that made her willing to make that choice? I believe she recognized the same thing her father had seen, something divine stirring beneath the surface of this enigmatic stranger. Moses carried himself differently than other men. There was a weight about him, a sense of destiny that couldn't be hidden even when he was living as a simple shepherd. Zipporah was choosing not just a husband, but a calling that would stretch her far beyond anything she could have anticipated. When they married, Zipporah became part of a story that was larger than either of their individual lives. She wasn't just joining herself to Moses the shepherd. She was unknowingly positioning herself to become part of the greatest redemption story in human history. Their marriage produced children, beginning with Gershom, whose name means stranger or sojourner, reflecting Moses' sense of displacement and temporary residence in a foreign land. But here's where the story takes a dramatic turn that most people miss. The years of quiet shepherding in Midian weren't just a peaceful interlude in Moses' life, they were intensive preparation. God was using that time to strip away Moses' Egyptian identity, to teach him humility, to show him how to lead and care for living creatures in harsh conditions. Every day spent guiding sheep through dangerous terrain was training for the day he would guide human beings through an even more treacherous wilderness. Zipporah witnessed this transformation. She saw the man she married change from a hot-tempered fugitive into someone with patience, wisdom, and an unusual sensitivity to the voice of God. She watched him develop the skills and character that would be essential for the calling that was coming. In many ways, she was the first person to see Moses become the Moses we read about in Scripture. And then came the day that changed everything. While Moses was tending the flock near Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, he encountered something that would shatter the quiet life they had built together. A bush that burned but was not consumed. And from that bush, the voice of the eternal God calling his name. In that moment, Moses' true destiny was revealed, and Zipporah's life was about to be turned completely upside down. The God who had been silently preparing Moses through years of wilderness training was now ready to use him. The same God who had orchestrated their meeting at the well, who had provided Moses with a sanctuary in Midian, who had given him a wife and children and a peaceful existence, was now calling him to leave it all behind and return to the very place he had fled as a fugitive. But here's what makes this even more remarkable. When God called Moses to return to Egypt and confront Pharaoh, he wasn't just calling Moses alone, he was calling the entire family. Zipporah, who had married a shepherd, was about to become the wife of the most significant prophet and leader in human history. The woman who had lived quietly in the desert was about to find herself at the center of supernatural plagues, miraculous deliverances, and the birth of a nation. The question is, was she ready for what was coming? And more importantly, what would this cosmic shift mean for her relationship with Moses and her place in the story of God's people? Because what happened next would test their marriage in ways that would make their quiet years in Midian seem like a distant dream. As we continue this journey into Zipporah's mysterious fate, we're going to discover that her story is far more complex and significant than most people realize. The woman who saved Moses' life in a supernatural encounter is about to face challenges that will reveal the true depth of her faith and the real cost of being chosen by God for purposes beyond our understanding. The journey from Midian back to Egypt would prove to be far more than a simple relocation. It would become a crucible that would test everything Zipporah thought she knew about her husband, her faith, and her place in God's unfolding plan. What began as obedience to a divine calling quickly transformed into a series of encounters that would shake the very foundation of their marriage and reveal truths that neither of them were prepared to face. Picture Moses returning home from that life-changing encounter at the burning bush. How do you tell your wife that the quiet life you've built together is over? How do you explain that the God of your fathers has appeared to you in supernatural fire and commissioned you to return to the land where you're wanted for murder? How do you describe a calling so massive that it will require abandoning everything familiar and stepping into the unknown? But Moses did exactly that. He told Zipporah about the burning bush, about the voice of God, about the mission to deliver the Hebrew people from Egyptian bondage, and remarkably, she agreed to go with him. This wasn't a small decision. Zipporah was leaving her homeland, her family, her father's protection, and the only life she had ever known. She was choosing to follow her husband into what could only be described as an impossible situation. Think about what this meant for her. She had to pack up their children, say goodbye to her sisters, leave behind the security of her father's household, and venture into a future that offered no guarantees except the promise that God had spoken. For a woman who had grown up in the relative stability of Midian, this required extraordinary faith and courage. The journey itself began peacefully enough. Moses, Zipporah, and their children set out toward Egypt, probably following the same routes Moses had traveled years earlier when he first fled as a fugitive. But somewhere along the way, something happened that would forever change the dynamic of their relationship and provide us with one of the most mysterious and disturbing passages in all of Scripture. The Bible records this incident with startling brevity, yet its implications are staggering. At a lodging place along the way, the Lord met Moses and sought to kill him. Read that again. The same God who had just commissioned Moses to deliver his people now appeared ready to destroy him. What could possibly explain such a dramatic reversal? The answer lies in a detail that reveals something profound about God's character and his expectations for those he calls. Moses had failed to circumcise one of his sons. This wasn't just a cultural oversight or a minor religious formality. Circumcision was the sign of the covenant God had established with Abraham, the physical mark that identified someone as belonging to the chosen people. For the man called to deliver the covenant people, failing to place the covenant sign on his own child was more than negligence. It was a fundamental contradiction. But here's where Zipporah's true character emerges in ways that will leave you stunned. While Moses lay helpless, apparently struck down by divine judgment, his wife acted with a decisiveness and spiritual insight that saved not just her husband's life, but the entire mission to deliver Israel. She took a flint knife, circumcised their son herself, and touched Moses' feet with the foreskin, declaring him a bridegroom of blood. Let that sink in for a moment. While the great deliverer lay powerless before the wrath of God, it was his Midianite wife who understood what needed to be done. She performed the covenant ritual that Moses had neglected. She shed the blood that satisfied divine justice. And she spoke words that revealed a deeper understanding of spiritual truth than anyone could have expected from a foreign woman. This incident tells us something remarkable about Zipporah's faith. She wasn't just going along with her husband's calling out of wifely duty. She understood the spiritual dimensions of what was happening. She recognized that God's covenant requirements were non-negotiable, even for the man chosen to lead his people. And when the moment of crisis came, she had the spiritual discernment and physical courage to do what needed to be done. But what did this experience do to their marriage? How do you process the fact that your husband nearly died because of a spiritual oversight? How do you move forward when you've had to save your spouse from divine judgment? The text doesn't tell us about their conversations afterward, but we can imagine the weight of what had just occurred settling over their relationship, like a shadow. From this point forward, Zipporah would know that being married to Moses meant being married to someone whose calling could literally be a matter of life and death. She had seen firsthand that God's standards for his chosen servants were absolute, that there was no room for compromise or casual obedience. The quiet shepherd she had married was gone forever, replaced by a man whose every action would be scrutinized by heaven itself. They continued their journey to Egypt, but now everything was different. Moses carried the weight of his calling more heavily, knowing how close he had come to losing everything before his mission even began. Zipporah carried the knowledge that she had been the instrument of her husband's deliverance, that without her decisive action, the entire story of Israel's redemption might have ended before it started. When they finally arrived in Egypt, the magnitude of what lay ahead became clear. This wasn't going to be a simple diplomatic mission or a brief negotiation with Pharaoh. Moses was walking into a supernatural confrontation that would pit the God of Israel against the gods of Egypt, that would unleash plagues unlike anything the world had ever seen, that would ultimately result in the death of every firstborn child in the land. What was it like for Zipporah to watch her husband transform from the man she had known in Midian into the Moses of the Exodus? To see him stand before the most powerful ruler on earth and demand the release of an entire enslaved population? To witness the rod in his hand become a serpent, the Nile River turn to blood, and supernatural plagues devastate the greatest empire of the ancient world? She was witnessing history being made, prophecy being fulfilled, and the power of God being demonstrated in ways that defied human understanding. But she was also watching her husband become someone increasingly consumed by a calling that left little room for the ordinary rhythms of family life. The weight of leading an entire nation out of bondage was changing Moses in ways that must have been both inspiring and isolating. During the months of plagues and confrontations with Pharaoh, where was Zipporah? The biblical text doesn't specifically mention her presence during these dramatic events, but we know she was there, somewhere in the background, caring for their children, while her husband faced down the mightiest empire on earth. She was living through the most significant supernatural intervention in human history, yet her experience of it was largely invisible to the biblical narrative. And then came the night that changed everything. Passover. The final plague. The death of the firstborn. Can you imagine what that night was like for a mother? Zipporah had to prepare her family for an event so terrifying that it would break Pharaoh's will and send an entire nation fleeing into the wilderness. She had to trust that the blood on their doorposts would protect her children from the angel of death that would sweep through Egypt before dawn. That night, as supernatural judgment fell on every Egyptian household, Zipporah experienced something that would mark her forever. She witnessed the price of redemption, the reality that deliverance comes through death, that freedom requires sacrifice. The woman who had once lived peacefully in Midian was now at the center of the most pivotal moment in the history of God's relationship with humanity. When morning came and Pharaoh finally released the Israelites, Zipporah found herself part of a massive exodus unlike anything the world had ever seen. Hundreds of thousands of people, perhaps as many as 2 million, streaming out of Egypt with their possessions, their livestock, and their hopes for a new beginning. But for her, this wasn't just a national liberation. It was the beginning of a journey that would test her faith, her marriage, and her identity in ways she could never have anticipated. The woman who had married a shepherd was now the wife of the leader of a nation. The quiet life she had known was gone forever, replaced by the chaos, challenges, and constant crises that come with guiding a massive population through uncharted territory. And somewhere in the midst of this incredible transformation, something began to shift in her relationship with Moses that would ultimately lead to one of the most puzzling mysteries in all of Scripture. Because what happened next would separate her from her husband in ways that the biblical text handles with such brevity that scholars have debated its meaning for thousands of years. The woman who had saved Moses' life was about to face a separation that would change everything about her story and leave us wondering about her ultimate fate. As the massive exodus began and hundreds of thousands of Israelites streamed out of Egypt, Zipporah found herself thrust into a reality that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. The woman who had once drawn water at a quiet well in Midian was now part of the greatest migration in human history, walking alongside a sea of humanity that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. But here's what most people miss about this moment. While the Israelites were celebrating their freedom, while they were singing songs of deliverance and praising God for their miraculous release from bondage, Zipporah was experiencing something entirely different. She was walking into a wilderness with 2 small children, following a husband who was no longer just hers, but belonged to an entire nation. Picture what those first days of the Exodus must have been like for her. The noise would have been overwhelming, the constant movement exhausting, the uncertainty about where they were going and how long it would take absolutely terrifying. These weren't organized military units marching in formation. This was a massive crowd of former slaves, many of whom had never traveled beyond the boundaries of their assigned labor sites, now wandering through unfamiliar territory, with everything they owned strapped to their backs or loaded onto carts. And Moses, he was no longer the attentive husband and father she had known in Midian. Now, he was constantly surrounded by tribal leaders, elders, and complainers. People approached him from dawn to dusk with disputes, questions, and demands. The man who had once shared quiet evenings with his family around a simple fire was now the focal point of every crisis, every decision, every moment of panic that arose among the people. The biblical narrative gives us glimpses of what this was like. When the people reached the Red Sea and saw Pharaoh's army approaching from behind, they cried out in terror and turned their anger toward Moses. They accused him of bringing them into the wilderness to die, of leading them out of Egypt only to face destruction. While Moses was receiving divine instructions about parting the waters, while he was preparing for one of the most spectacular miracles in human history, what was Zipporah doing? She was probably trying to keep her children calm while chaos erupted around them. She was watching her husband bear the weight of an entire nation's fear and doubt. She was seeing him transform from the man she married into something larger and more distant. Someone whose primary relationship was no longer with his family, but with the God who had called him and the people he was commissioned to lead. Then came the miracle at the Red Sea, and Zipporah witnessed something that would forever change her understanding of who her husband really was. When Moses raised his staff and the waters parted, when the entire nation walked through on dry ground, while walls of water towered on both sides, when Pharaoh's army was swallowed by the returning sea, she realized she was married to someone through whom the creator of the universe was choosing to work in unprecedented ways. But miracles, as spectacular as they are, don't solve the practical problems of daily life. Once they were safely on the other side of the Red Sea, once the initial euphoria of deliverance had faded, the real challenges of wilderness survival began to set in. And those challenges would test Zipporah's faith and patience in ways that the dramatic confrontations with Pharaoh never had. The people began to complain about everything. They grumbled about the lack of food, the scarcity of water, the uncertainty of their destination. They romanticized their time in Egypt, conveniently forgetting the brutality of their slavery and focusing instead on the regular meals they had received. And every complaint, every crisis, every moment of dissatisfaction was brought directly to Moses. Can you imagine what it was like for Zipporah to watch her husband absorb the constant criticism and ingratitude of the very people he had risked everything to deliver? To see him age rapidly under the stress of leading a nation that seemed determined to second-guess his every decision? To realize that the man she had married was now public property, belonging more to the multitude than to his own family? And then something happened that would create a crack in their relationship that the biblical text handles with such delicacy that we almost miss its significance. Moses sent Zipporah and their children back to her father Jethro in Midian. The scripture records this with stunning brevity, offering no explanation for why this separation occurred or how either of them felt about it. Think about what this meant. At some point during the early stages of the wilderness journey, Moses made the decision that his wife and children would be better off away from the camp of Israel. Was this for their safety? Was it because the hardships of wilderness travel were too much for young children? Was it because the constant demands of leadership left Moses with no time or energy for his family? Or was there something deeper happening? Had Zipporah expressed doubts about the direction Moses was taking? Had she questioned whether this endless wandering in the wilderness was really God's plan? Had the woman who had once saved her husband's life through decisive spiritual action now become a source of doubt or distraction in his mind? The text doesn't tell us, but the silence itself is deafening. Here was the woman who had recognized Moses' potential when he was just a fugitive shepherd, who had married him when he had nothing to offer but uncertainty, who had saved his life through her quick thinking and spiritual insight. And now she was being sent away during the most significant period of his calling. What conversations preceded this separation? What words were spoken or left unspoken between them? Did Moses explain his reasoning, or did he simply announce his decision as another burden of leadership? Did Zipporah argue or accept the arrangement with the same quiet strength she had shown throughout their marriage? We can only imagine the pain and confusion this must have caused for both of them. But here's what we do know. Zipporah didn't just disappear from the story at this point. She returned to her father's household, where she raised Moses' children in the safety and stability of Midian, while their father led Israel through the most challenging period in their national history. She was no longer part of the daily drama of the Exodus, but she was preserving the family line of the man God was using to establish his people as a nation. Meanwhile, Moses continued deeper into the wilderness without his family by his side. He climbed Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments. He mediated between God and a rebellious people. He dealt with golden calves and murmuring multitudes, and he carried the crushing weight of leadership largely alone. The man who had once shared his burdens with a wise and decisive wife now faced the greatest challenges of his calling without her counsel or support. This separation would last for what appears to be a significant period of time. While Moses was establishing the tabernacle, organizing the priesthood, and laying the foundation for Israel's religious and civil law, Zipporah was living quietly in Midian, probably wondering if she would ever see her husband again, if her children would grow up knowing their father only through stories and distant memories. But then something remarkable happened that gives us hope for their relationship and provides a glimpse into what kind of woman Zipporah had become during their time apart. Jethro, her father, decided to visit Moses in the wilderness, and he brought Zipporah and her children with him. This wasn't just a family reunion, it was a moment that would reveal how both Moses and Zipporah had changed during their separation. The reunion is recorded in Exodus chapter 18, and what we see there is fascinating. Jethro arrived at the Israelite camp not just as Moses' father-in-law, but as a priest and counselor who had wisdom to offer. He observed Moses trying to handle every dispute and decision for the entire nation by himself, working from morning to evening with no rest and no delegation of authority. And here's where we see the influence of Zipporah, even in what isn't directly stated. Jethro's advice to Moses about establishing judges and sharing the burden of leadership was exactly the kind of practical wisdom that Zipporah had probably been offering throughout their marriage. The woman who had acted decisively during the crisis with circumcision, who had demonstrated both spiritual insight and practical judgment, had likely been the kind of counselor Moses desperately needed, but had sent away. Did Zipporah say anything during this reunion? Did she offer her own observations about the unsustainable way Moses was trying to lead? The text doesn't record her words, but her presence during this crucial moment of organizational reform suggests that her wisdom was still valued, even if it couldn't be publicly acknowledged in the same way her father's advice was received. What we do know is that after Jethro's visit, after Moses had implemented the system of shared leadership that would make his burden more manageable, the old priest returned to his own land. But what about Zipporah? Did she go back to Midian with her father? Or did she remain with Moses in the wilderness? This is where the mystery deepens and where the biblical silence becomes most puzzling. Because from this point forward, Zipporah virtually disappears from the biblical narrative. We hear about Moses' sister Miriam. We read about conflicts with his brother Aaron. We learn about his interactions with Joshua and other leaders. But Zipporah becomes a ghost in the story, present perhaps, but invisible to the text. The woman who had played such a crucial role in Moses' early calling, who had saved his life and enabled his mission to continue, who had borne his children and supported him through years of preparation, now fades from view just when we most want to know what happened to her. Did she stay with Moses for the remaining decades of wilderness wandering? Did she witness the giving of the law, the building of the tabernacle, the organization of the priesthood? Or did she return to Midian permanently, spending the rest of her life as a separated wife, raising her children in the security of her father's household, while her husband fulfilled a calling that had ultimately required him to choose between his family and his nation? The biblical text offers no clear answer, leaving us to wrestle with questions that have no definitive resolution. But perhaps that silence is itself part of the story. Perhaps Zipporah's disappearance from the narrative reflects something profound about the cost of divine calling, about the sacrifices required when God chooses someone for purposes larger than their personal happiness or family stability. Her fading from view might represent the countless unnamed individuals whose lives are forever changed by their proximity to those called to great purposes. What we can say with certainty is that Zipporah's influence on Moses and on the story of Israel's formation was far greater than the brevity of her appearances in Scripture might suggest. She was there during the crucial early stages of his calling. She provided stability and wisdom during his years of preparation, and she acted decisively during moments of spiritual crisis. Whether she spent her final years with Moses in the wilderness or back in Midian with her father, her contribution to the story of redemption was irreplaceable. As we continue to explore the mystery of her ultimate fate, we'll discover that the questions surrounding Zipporah's disappearance reveal important truths about faith, sacrifice, and the sometimes painful cost of being connected to those whom God chooses for extraordinary purposes. Her story challenges us to consider what we're willing to give up when divine calling intersects with human relationships, and what it means to support those whose destinies are larger than our own understanding can encompass. The silence surrounding Zipporah's later years becomes even more haunting when we consider what else was happening in Moses' life during this period. Because while his wife had vanished from the biblical narrative, something else was unfolding that would add another layer of complexity to this already mysterious story. Moses remarried, and not just to anyone, but to a Cushite woman, creating a situation that would ignite family conflict and reveal deep tensions about identity, calling, and loyalty that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. Numbers. Chapter 12 records this development with the same frustrating brevity that characterizes so much of Zipporah's story. We're told that Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman he had married. But here's what makes this so puzzling and painful when we consider Zipporah's fate. If she was still alive and still married to Moses, then what was happening here? Was this a case of polygamy, which wasn't uncommon in ancient times, but would have been devastating for a wife who had already sacrificed so much? Or had something happened to Zipporah that the text doesn't record? Had she died during the wilderness years, leaving Moses free to remarry? The possibility that she had passed away without any biblical acknowledgement of her death would be heartbreaking enough. But there's another possibility that's even more troubling. What if she was still alive, but their marriage had effectively ended through permanent separation? Think about the implications of either scenario. If Zipporah had died, then Moses had lost not just his wife, but the one person who had known him before his calling, transformed him into a national leader. She would have taken with her all the memories of their quiet years in Midian, their early love, the man he had been before the weight of leading a nation had changed him forever. Her death would have represented the final severing of his connection to the person he had been before God called him at the burning bush. But if she was still alive, living separated from her husband while he took another wife, the pain would have been excruciating in a completely different way. Imagine being Zipporah, having sacrificed everything to support Moses' calling, having saved his life when God's judgment threatened to destroy him, having borne his children and shared his years of preparation, only to find yourself permanently displaced by the very mission you had helped make possible. The identity of this Cushite woman adds another layer to the mystery. Cush typically referred to the region south of Egypt, what we might call Sudan or Ethiopia today. So Moses, who had married a Midianite woman from the east, had now taken a wife from Africa. What drew him to her? Was it love, political alliance, or simply companionship after years of isolation? And what did this mean for his children with Zipporah, who were now watching their father build a new family, while their mother remained absent from his life? The reaction of Miriam and Aaron tells us something significant about how this remarriage was perceived within Moses' own family. They weren't just making casual observations about their brother's personal choices. They were speaking against him, criticizing him, suggesting that this marriage was somehow inappropriate or problematic. Were they defending Zipporah's honor? Were they concerned about the political implications of Moses marrying outside the covenant community? Or were they using his marriage as a pretext to challenge his leadership authority? What makes their criticism even more interesting is how God responded to it. Rather than defending Moses' right to marry whom he chose, or explaining the circumstances that led to this union, God struck Miriam with leprosy as punishment for speaking against his chosen servant. The message was clear. Moses' personal decisions were not up for family debate, and those who challenged his choices were challenging God himself. But this divine defense of Moses raises uncomfortable questions about justice and favoritism. If Moses had indeed abandoned or divorced Zipporah to marry this Cushite woman, why would God punish those who criticized him for it? If Zipporah was still alive and suffering because of her husband's choices, why wasn't her pain acknowledged or addressed? The silence becomes even more deafening when we realize that God himself chose not to explain or justify what had happened. Perhaps the answer lies in understanding something deeper about the nature of divine calling and its impact on human relationships. Moses wasn't just a man making personal choices about marriage and family. He was the mediator between God and an entire nation, the one through whom divine law and covenant were being established. His decisions, even his personal ones, carried weight that extended far beyond individual happiness or conventional morality. This doesn't make the potential suffering of Zipporah any less real or heartbreaking, but it might explain why the biblical narrative handles these matters with such restraint. The text isn't primarily concerned with documenting personal relationships or individual emotional journeys. It's focused on the larger story of how God was forming a people and establishing his covenant with them through chosen representatives. Still, the human cost of that divine purpose cannot be ignored. Whether Zipporah died forgotten in the wilderness, or lived separated from the husband she had supported through his most crucial years, her story represents the often hidden price paid by those who love and support. Individuals called to purposes beyond themselves. She reminds us that behind every great calling, there are often unnamed people whose sacrifices make that calling possible, but who never receive recognition for their contributions. The mystery deepens when we consider what happened to Zipporah's children during this period. Gershom and Eleazar, the sons she had borne to Moses, would have been young men by this time. Did they remain with their father in the Israelite camp? Or did they stay with their mother wherever she was? If Moses had effectively abandoned his first family, what did this mean for his relationship with these sons who carried his name but might have felt displaced by his new priorities? We know that Moses' calling required him to prioritize the needs of the entire Israelite nation above his personal relationships. Every decision he made had to be filtered through the lens of what was best for God's people as a whole. But this creates a troubling tension between divine calling and human loyalty. How do we reconcile the Moses who received the commandment to honor father and mother with the Moses who may have abandoned the mother of his own children? Perhaps the answer is that we're not meant to reconcile it easily. Perhaps the discomfort we feel about Zipporah's fate is intentional, designed to make us wrestle with the real cost of divine calling and the sometimes painful choices it requires. The biblical text doesn't offer us easy answers or comfortable resolutions, because life itself rarely provides them. What we can say is that Zipporah's disappearance from the narrative doesn't diminish her significance in the story of Israel's formation. Her early intervention in Moses' spiritual crisis, her support during his years of preparation, her willingness to leave everything familiar and follow him into the unknown, these contributions were essential to the success of his mission. Without her decisive action when God sought to kill Moses for failing to circumcise their son, the entire Exodus might never have happened. In many ways, Zipporah represents all the unnamed and unrecognized people whose sacrifices make possible the great movements of God in human history. She stands for every spouse who has supported a partner's calling, even when it cost them personally. Every parent who has raised children while their partner was consumed with divine purpose. Every person who has loved someone whose destiny was larger than their relationship. Her story also challenges us to consider what we owe to those who support our own callings and purposes. If God uses us for significant purposes, what responsibility do we bear toward the people who made our service possible? How do we balance divine calling with human loyalty? These are questions without easy answers, but they're questions that Zipporah's story forces us to confront. As we move toward understanding her ultimate fate, we must grapple with the possibility that some questions are meant to remain mysteries. Perhaps the biblical silence about Zipporah's later years isn't an oversight or a gap in the narrative, but a deliberate choice to focus our attention on what matters most in the eternal scope of God's purposes. But that doesn't mean we should stop asking the questions or stop feeling the weight of her disappearance from the story, because in wrestling with the mystery of what happened to Zipporah, we're wrestling with fundamental questions about love, sacrifice, calling, and the price of being connected to those whom God chooses for purposes beyond our understanding. The woman who saved Moses' life in a moment of divine crisis deserves better than to simply vanish from history without explanation. Yet perhaps her disappearance itself is part of the message, a reminder that not all contributions are publicly acknowledged, that not all sacrifices are recorded in the annals of history, but that God sees and remembers even when human memory fails. As we continue to explore the possibilities surrounding her fate, we must hold in tension both the mystery of what we don't know and the significance of what we do know about this remarkable woman who played such a crucial role in the early stages of Israel's story. Her legacy lives on not just in the questions she leaves us with, but in the example she set of decisive faith action when the stakes couldn't have been higher. What emerges from the shadows of Scripture, however, is a pattern that might hold the key to understanding Zipporah's ultimate destiny. Because while the biblical text remains silent about her specific fate, it speaks volumes about the broader context in which her story unfolds. And when we examine that context carefully, we begin to see possibilities that are both hopeful and heartbreaking. Scenarios that could explain not just what happened to her, but why her disappearance was handled with such mysterious brevity. Consider this. Throughout the wilderness years, Moses was receiving direct revelation from God about everything from dietary laws to civil procedures, from religious festivals to military strategies. The divine instructions were incredibly detailed, covering aspects of life that seem almost mundane compared to the cosmic scope of leading a nation out of bondage. Yet nowhere in all these revelations do we find any mention of what Moses should do about his separated wife or his distant children. This silence becomes even more significant when we realize that family relationships were central to the covenant community God was establishing. The commandments included honoring father and mother. The laws addressed marriage, divorce, inheritance, and family responsibilities in great detail. God clearly cared about how his people structured their domestic lives. So why the complete absence of any divine guidance about Moses' personal family situation? One possibility is that Zipporah's separation from Moses wasn't an abandonment or divorce in the sense we might understand it, but rather a strategic decision that both of them made together for reasons that went far beyond personal preference. What if sending her back to Midian wasn't about Moses choosing his calling over his family, but about positioning her where she could serve God's purposes in ways that wouldn't have been possible in the Israelite camp? Think about this carefully. Zipporah wasn't just any Midianite woman. She was the daughter of Jethro, a priest who clearly understood divine calling and who had already demonstrated his ability to provide Moses with crucial counsel. When Jethro visited the Israelite camp and observed Moses' unsustainable leadership style, his advice about delegating authority and establishing judges transformed the entire administrative structure of the emerging nation. What if Zipporah's return to Midian was part of a larger divine strategy to maintain relationships between Israel and the surrounding peoples who weren't enemies but weren't quite family either? The Midianites were descendants of Abraham through Keturah. They weren't Canaanites marked for destruction or Egyptians representing oppression. They were relatives, distant cousins who worshipped the same God, but had developed along different cultural lines. During the 40 years Israel spent wandering in the wilderness, they would need allies, trading partners, sources of information about terrain and resources. Having Moses' wife and children living among the Midianites could have served as a bridge between the two peoples, a guarantee of peaceful relations that protected both communities during a period of massive regional upheaval. From this perspective, Zipporah's separation from Moses takes on entirely different significance. Rather than being abandoned, she might have been entrusted with a diplomatic mission that was crucial to Israel's survival, but too sensitive to be recorded in detail in the biblical narrative. Her presence in Midian would have ensured that her father's people remained friendly to Israel, that trade relationships could continue, that intelligence about potential threats could flow between the communities. This would explain why the biblical text handles her departure with such restraint. If Zipporah was serving as an unofficial ambassador, if her separation from Moses was a sacrifice both of them made for the greater good of God's people, then publicizing the details might have undermined her effectiveness or put her in danger. The silence wasn't neglect, it was protection. But there's another possibility that's even more intriguing when we consider the timing of events and the broader patterns of God's dealings with his chosen servants. What if Zipporah didn't simply fade away into obscurity, but was being prepared for a role that wouldn't become apparent until much later in the story? Remember, Moses himself spent 40 years in Midian before God called him to deliver Israel. 40 years of preparation, of learning desert survival, of developing the character and skills he would need for his ultimate calling. What if Zipporah's time away from Moses was her own period of preparation for something significant that was yet to come? Consider what she would have learned during those years in her father's household. She would have gained intimate knowledge of Midianite culture, politics, and trade relationships. She would have maintained connections throughout the region that could prove invaluable. She would have raised Moses' children with an understanding of both their Hebrew heritage and their Midianite connections, creating a new generation that could bridge both worlds. Most importantly, she would have had time to process the incredible experiences of her early marriage, to understand the spiritual dimensions of what she had witnessed, to develop her own relationship with the God who had used her to save Moses' life. The woman who had acted so decisively during the circumcision crisis had demonstrated remarkable spiritual insight. Given years to mature and reflect, what might she have become? This leads us to one of the most tantalizing possibilities surrounding Zipporah's fate. What if her story didn't end with quiet obscurity in Midian, but continued in ways that the biblical narrative chose not to record because they belong to a different strand of God's unfolding plan? Throughout the Old Testament, we see God working through multiple families, multiple lineages, multiple streams of influence to accomplish his purposes. The story of Israel is the main narrative thread, but it's not the only thread. There are other peoples, other nations, other individuals who serve divine purposes, even when they're not part of the central covenant community. What if Zipporah became the matriarch of something significant among the Midianites? What if her children, raised with knowledge of both their Hebrew heritage and their Midianite identity, became leaders who influenced the region in ways that served God's broader purposes? What if her own spiritual development during those years of separation led her to become a teacher, a prophet, a bridge between different communities, seeking to understand the God of Abraham? The biblical text doesn't tell us these things because its focus is on the formation of Israel as a covenant nation, but that doesn't mean these other developments weren't happening. It just means they weren't part of the specific story the biblical authors were called to record. There's precedent for this kind of behind-the-scenes divine activity throughout Scripture. We read about the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon, but we don't get her full story. We hear about the wise men from the East who came to worship the infant Jesus, but we don't follow them back to their homelands to see what happened next. We encounter Melchizedek, the mysterious priest-king who blessed Abraham, but we never learn about his origins or his ultimate fate. The Bible is filled with characters who appear briefly, make significant contributions to the main narrative, and then disappear into mystery. Their stories don't end. They just move beyond the scope of what we're given to see. Zipporah might well be one of these figures, someone whose ultimate significance won't be fully understood until we have access to the complete picture of how God has been working throughout human history. But let's consider another scenario entirely, one that brings us back to the immediate context of the Israelite camp and the challenges Moses faced during the wilderness years. What if Zipporah's disappearance from the narrative isn't because she went away, but because she chose to blend into the background of the community in ways that made her invisible to the historical record? Think about what it would have been like for the wife of Moses to live among the Israelites during those turbulent decades. Every decision Moses made was scrutinized, criticized, debated. Every policy he implemented created factions and opposition. The people complained constantly about leadership, about direction, about the hardships of wilderness life. They romanticized their time in Egypt and questioned whether Moses really knew what he was doing. In that environment, being publicly recognized as Moses' wife would have made Zipporah a target for every grievance, every frustration, every political maneuver aimed at undermining his authority. People would have approached her constantly, trying to influence Moses through her, trying to get her to intercede in disputes, trying to use their relationship to gain advantage or express dissatisfaction. What if Zipporah made a deliberate choice to step back from public visibility in order to protect both Moses and herself from this kind of manipulation? What if she remained in the camp but lived quietly, perhaps even under a different identity, supporting her husband's mission while avoiding the political complications that would have come with being publicly acknowledged as the leader's wife? This would explain why she disappears from the biblical narrative while other family members like Miriam and Aaron remain prominent. They had official roles in the community that required public recognition. Miriam was a prophetess, Aaron was the high priest, but Zipporah had no official position that would have necessitated public acknowledgement. She could have chosen anonymity as a way of serving God's purposes more effectively. From this perspective, her absence from the text becomes a form of presence. She was there, supporting Moses through the most difficult period of his leadership, but doing so in ways that didn't require historical documentation. Her love for him expressed itself not through public demonstration, but through private sacrifice, through choosing his success over her own recognition. This interpretation gains credibility when we consider how the biblical text handles other sensitive family dynamics. David's relationships with his wives and children are recorded selectively, focusing on incidents that had public significance while passing over many personal details. Solomon's marriages are mentioned primarily when they had political implications. The biblical authors weren't writing comprehensive biographies. They were recording the aspects of personal relationships that intersected with God's covenant purposes. If Zipporah spent her later years as a supportive but private presence in Moses' life, if she chose to love him through anonymity rather than visibility, then her disappearance from the narrative becomes not a sign of abandonment, but of extraordinary devotion. She would have been demonstrating the same kind of decisive wisdom she had shown during the circumcision crisis, recognizing what the situation required and acting accordingly regardless of personal cost. But there's one more possibility we need to consider, one that brings us full circle to the mystery of her ultimate fate and forces us to confront the most difficult questions about divine calling and human sacrifice. What if Zipporah's story ended not with quiet obscurity or strategic separation, but with a tragedy that the biblical text chose not to record because it was too painful to document? The wilderness years were brutal. People died from disease, from accidents, from the harsh conditions of desert life. Entire generations passed away during those 4 decades of wandering. The biblical text records some of these deaths when they had particular significance, like the rebellion of Korah or the incident with the bronze serpent. But it doesn't catalogue every loss, every personal tragedy, every family that was broken by the challenges of survival in an unforgiving environment. What if Zipporah died during the wilderness years, but her death occurred during a period when Moses was dealing with other crises, other challenges that demanded the community's attention? What if her passing was mourned privately by those who knew her, but wasn't recorded in the historical narrative because it coincided with events of greater national significance? This possibility is heartbreaking to consider, but it would explain both her disappearance from the text and the silence that surrounds Moses' later marriage to the Cushite woman. If Zipporah had died, if Moses had grieved her loss while continuing to bear the burden of leading an entire nation, then his eventual remarriage would represent not abandonment, but the natural progression of a man trying to rebuild his life after devastating personal loss. The criticism from Miriam and Aaron about his Cushite wife would take on different meaning in this context. They might not have been defending Zipporah's honor as a living woman, but protecting her memory as someone who deserved to be remembered and honored. Their objection might have been not to Moses remarrying, but to how quickly he seemed to have moved on from the wife who had played such a crucial role in his early calling. God's angry response to their criticism would then represent not just defense of Moses' personal choices, but judgment against those who presumed to dictate how he should process grief and loss. The divine message would be clear. Moses had already sacrificed more than anyone could imagine for the sake of his calling, and he deserved support rather than additional criticism from his own family. If this scenario is accurate, then Zipporah's fate was indeed tragic, but not because she was abandoned or forgotten. Rather, she would have been another casualty of the wilderness years, another person whose life was cut short by the harsh realities of that transitional period in Israel's history. Her death would have been mourned by those who knew her contributions, even if it wasn't recorded for posterity. Yet even in death, her influence would have continued through her children, through the lessons Moses had learned from their relationship, through the spiritual insights she had provided during crucial moments of his development. The woman who had saved his life through decisive action would have shaped his character in ways that continued to influence his leadership long after she was gone. Each of these possibilities, whether hopeful or tragic, forces us to confront the reality that some questions about biblical figures may never be definitively answered. The silence surrounding Zipporah's ultimate fate might be intentional, designed to make us wrestle with larger questions about faithfulness, sacrifice, and the hidden costs of divine calling. What we can say with certainty is that her story matters, regardless of how it ended. She represents something essential about the human dimension of God's work in the world. Behind every great calling, every significant ministry, every divine purpose, there are people whose contributions make success possible even when they never receive recognition for their sacrifices. Zipporah reminds us that God's plans often require not just the obvious heroes, but also the hidden supporters, the quiet servants, the ones who act decisively when everything hangs in the balance, but then step back into obscurity when their moment of visibility is over. Her legacy lives on, not just in the questions she leaves us with, but in the examples she provides of what it means to love someone whose destiny is larger than any individual relationship. As we near the end of our exploration into her mysterious fate, we must acknowledge that the silence of Scripture regarding her later years might itself be part of the message. Perhaps we're meant to focus not on what we don't know about her ending, but on what we do know about her character and contributions. Perhaps the mystery is designed to make us more grateful for the glimpses we're given, more aware of the countless unnamed individuals whose faithfulness makes possible the great movements of God in human history. The woman who married a shepherd and found herself wed to the greatest leader in Hebrew history deserves to be remembered, not for the questions surrounding her disappearance, but for the decisive moments when she stood at the center of salvation history and acted with the kind of faith and wisdom that changed everything. Whether her story ended in tragedy or triumph, in obscurity or significance, her place in the narrative of redemption is secure. But there's still one more layer to this mystery that we haven't fully explored. One final possibility that might explain not just what happened to Zipporah, but why her fate has remained hidden for so long. And this possibility takes us beyond the immediate context of the Exodus story into questions about the nature of biblical revelation itself and what it means for characters to disappear from one narrative only to emerge in another. Because what if Zipporah's disappearance from the Mosaic narrative wasn't the end of her story at all, but rather the beginning of something we've completely overlooked? What if the biblical authors, guided by divine inspiration, chose to veil her later years, not because they were insignificant, but because they were part of a different thread in God's tapestry that wouldn't become clear until we examine the broader patterns of how Scripture handles the wives and families of its most prominent figures? Consider this carefully. Throughout the Old Testament, we see a recurring pattern where the wives of major biblical figures seem to fade from view precisely when their husbands' callings reach their most intense phases. Sarah disappears from much of Abraham's later story. Rebekah becomes largely invisible during Isaac's most significant moments. Rachel dies before Joseph's greatest trials and triumphs. It's as if there's something about the weight of divine calling that creates a separation between public ministry and private relationships that the biblical text acknowledges but doesn't always explain. But here's what's fascinating about this pattern. These women don't just vanish into irrelevance. Instead, their influence continues through channels that aren't always immediately obvious. Their children carry forward their wisdom, their character, their spiritual insights. Their early contributions to their husband's development continue to bear fruit long after they've stepped out of the spotlight. Their legacies live on in ways that transcend their visible presence in the narrative. What if Zipporah fits this same pattern, but in ways we haven't fully recognized? What if her disappearance from Moses' story was actually her transition into a different kind of significance, one that operated behind the scenes of recorded history, but was no less crucial to God's unfolding purposes? Think about what we know happened during the 40 years Israel spent in the wilderness. They weren't isolated from the surrounding peoples. They encountered various tribes, negotiated passage through different territories, engaged in trade, formed temporary alliances, and navigated complex political relationships with nations that weren't necessarily enemies, but weren't part of the covenant community either. Who would have been better positioned to facilitate these relationships than someone who understood both Hebrew culture and the customs of the surrounding peoples? Who would have had more credibility as a mediator between Israel and the various tribal confederations they encountered than the woman who had been married to Moses during his formative years, but who also maintained deep roots in the Midianite community? What if Zipporah spent her later years not in quiet retirement or tragic obscurity, but as an unofficial diplomat, a cultural bridge, a behind-the-scenes negotiator who helped Israel navigate the treacherous political landscape of the ancient Near East? Her absence from the biblical narrative wouldn't reflect insignificance, but rather the sensitive nature of diplomatic work that couldn't be publicized without compromising its effectiveness. This possibility gains credibility when we consider how often biblical women operated in spheres of influence that weren't recorded in the official histories, but were nevertheless crucial to the outcomes those histories describe. Esther's story might never have been known if it hadn't intersected so dramatically with the survival of the Jewish people. Rahab's assistance to the Israelite spies could easily have remained a secret if it hadn't been essential to understanding how Jericho fell. How many other women throughout biblical history played crucial roles that went unrecorded simply because their contributions operated in realms that didn't require public documentation? How many diplomatic marriages, strategic alliances, intelligence networks, and cultural exchanges were facilitated by women whose names we'll never know, but whose work was essential to the survival and success of God's people? Zipporah's unique background would have made her perfectly suited for this kind of work. She had grown up in a priestly household, which meant she understood religious protocols and spiritual authority. She had lived among the Israelites during their most formative period, which gave her insight into their laws, customs, and organizational structure. She had witnessed the power of God firsthand, which would have given her credibility when speaking about divine purpose and covenant relationships. Most importantly, she had demonstrated the ability to act decisively under pressure, to recognize spiritual realities that others missed, and to take appropriate action even when the stakes were life and death. These weren't skills that would have diminished with age, or become irrelevant once Moses no longer needed her immediate support. Instead, they would have made her an invaluable asset for the kinds of complex negotiations and cultural mediation that Israel's survival required. But there's another dimension to this mystery that we need to explore, one that takes us deeper into questions about the nature of calling itself and how God uses different people for different purposes at different times. What if Zipporah's separation from Moses wasn't just about practical considerations or diplomatic necessities, but about her own spiritual development and divine calling? Remember, she had saved Moses' life during a moment of divine judgment. She had recognized what needed to be done when even Moses himself was helpless. She had acted with spiritual authority and understanding that went far beyond what anyone could have expected from someone outside the covenant community. These weren't accidental abilities or momentary inspirations. They suggested a spiritual sensitivity and divine connection that could have developed into something significant given the right circumstances. What if her years away from Moses were actually a period of preparation for her own calling? Just as Moses' 40 years in Midian had prepared him for his role as Israel's deliverer. What if God was developing her spiritual gifts, her understanding of his purposes, her ability to serve his people in ways that complemented rather than competed with her husband's mission? This wouldn't have been unprecedented. Throughout Scripture, we see examples of individuals who serve God's purposes in ways that operate alongside but separately from the main narrative thread. Melchizedek appears briefly in Abraham's story, but clearly had his own significant ministry that we know almost nothing about. The wise men from the east came to worship Jesus, but then returned to their own lands to continue serving God in ways the biblical text doesn't record. What if Zipporah became something similar? A servant of God whose ministry operated in spheres that didn't intersect directly with Moses' leadership of Israel, but were nevertheless crucial to the broader purposes God was accomplishing in that region during that period. Her spiritual insights, her cultural knowledge, her diplomatic skills could have been used to prepare the ground for future developments that wouldn't become apparent until much later in Israel's history. Consider the long-term implications of having someone with her background and experience working among the Midianites and related peoples during the wilderness years. She would have been ideally positioned to influence attitudes toward Israel, to counter negative propaganda, to build relationships that could prove crucial during future conflicts or negotiations. Her presence could have helped ensure that Israel's northern and eastern flanks remained relatively secure during their vulnerable period of national formation. More importantly, she could have been laying the groundwork for future missionary activity, preparing hearts and minds among the surrounding peoples for the eventual revelation of God's universal purposes. The woman who had recognized divine authority when she saw it, who had acted to preserve God's chosen servant, might have spent her later years helping others develop the same kind of spiritual discernment and readiness to respond to divine calling. This interpretation transforms her disappearance from the biblical narrative from a tragedy or oversight into a strategic deployment. Rather than being abandoned or forgotten, she would have been entrusted with a mission that was too important and too sensitive to be documented in detail. Her love for Moses would have found expression not through continued proximity, but through service to the same God who had called him, working to advance the same purposes through different methods and in different spheres. But let's consider yet another possibility. one that brings us back to the immediate context of Moses' family and the complex dynamics of leadership during the wilderness years. What if Zipporah's absence from the later narrative reflects not her physical departure, but a deliberate choice to protect Moses from the kinds of family complications that could have undermined his authority or distracted him from his calling? We see hints of this kind of family tension in the criticism Moses faced from Miriam and Aaron about his Cushite wife. If Zipporah had remained prominently visible in the camp, if she had been publicly acknowledged as Moses' primary wife while he was also married to this other woman, the potential for conflict, gossip, and political manipulation would have been enormous. Ancient Near Eastern societies were familiar with polygamous arrangements, but they were also keenly aware of the tensions such arrangements could create. The dynamics between different wives, the questions about which children had priority in inheritance, the opportunities for rivals to exploit family divisions for political advantage. All of these factors could have created exactly the kinds of distractions and complications that Moses couldn't afford, while trying to lead a fractious people through a dangerous wilderness. What if Zipporah recognized this danger and made the ultimate sacrifice for her husband's mission? What if she chose to step back from public visibility, perhaps even from their marriage relationship, in order to eliminate these potential sources of conflict and allow Moses to focus entirely on his calling without the burden of managing complex family dynamics? This would represent an extraordinary level of spiritual maturity and self-sacrifice. It would mean that the same woman who had acted decisively to save Moses' life early in their marriage later chose to sacrifice her own happiness and recognition to preserve his effectiveness as a leader. Her disappearance from the narrative would reflect not abandonment, but the highest form of love, a willingness to give up everything that mattered to her personally in order to serve the greater purposes God was accomplishing through her husband. From this perspective, her silence becomes eloquent testimony to her character. She loved Moses enough to marry him when he was a nobody, to follow him into the unknown when God called him, to save his life when divine judgment threatened him, and ultimately to release him when his calling required a level of focus that their relationship couldn't accommodate without creating problems for the people he was called to serve. This interpretation also helps explain why the biblical text handles her disappearance with such restraint. If she had made this sacrifice willingly, if she had chosen to step back for the good of Moses' mission, then documenting the details of their separation or her personal struggles with this decision would have violated the very privacy she had chosen to create. The silence would be a form of respect for her choice, an acknowledgement that some sacrifices are too sacred to be exposed to public scrutiny. It would also explain why Moses' later marriage to the Cushite woman wasn't presented as a betrayal or abandonment. If Zipporah had released him from their marriage obligations in order to serve God's purposes more effectively, then his remarriage would have been not only permissible, but perhaps even necessary for his emotional and psychological well-being during the incredibly stressful period of wilderness leadership. The criticism from Miriam and Aaron would then represent not defense of Zipporah's rights as an abandoned wife, but perhaps disapproval of Moses moving on too quickly from a sacrifice they felt deserved longer recognition. Their objection might have been less about the appropriateness of his remarriage and more about what they perceived as insufficient appreciation for what Zipporah had given up to make his continued leadership possible. God's angry response to their criticism would make perfect sense in this context. If Zipporah had made her sacrifice willingly and with divine approval, if her stepping back had been part of God's own plan for maximizing Moses' effectiveness, then Miriam and Aaron's criticism would have been not just inappropriate, but actually contrary to God's will. They would have been second-guessing not just Moses' personal decisions, but divine strategy itself. This possibility forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the cost of divine calling and the kinds of sacrifices it sometimes requires. If Zipporah did indeed choose to release Moses for the sake of his mission, what does this tell us about the nature of love, loyalty, and service to God's purposes? How do we balance personal relationships with divine calling when the two seem to conflict? These aren't easy questions, and Scripture doesn't offer simple answers. But perhaps that's the point. Perhaps Zipporah's mysterious fate is designed to make us wrestle with these tensions rather than resolve them neatly. Her story challenges us to consider what we would be willing to sacrifice for the sake of God's purposes, and what we would expect from those who love us, when divine calling creates conflicts between personal happiness and spiritual obedience. What emerges from all these possibilities is a portrait of a woman whose significance far exceeded her visibility in the biblical narrative. Whether she spent her later years in diplomatic service, spiritual ministry, strategic obscurity, or sacrificial withdrawal, her impact on the story of Israel's formation was profound and lasting. The woman who had saved Moses' life continued to serve God's purposes even when that service required her to step out of the spotlight and allow others to receive the recognition. Her legacy challenges us to expand our understanding of what it means to serve God faithfully. Not all callings require public visibility. Not all contributions are recorded in the annals of history. Not all sacrifices receive immediate recognition or reward. But God sees and remembers even when human memory fails, and the ultimate significance of our lives may depend more on our faithfulness in hidden places than on our visibility in public arenas. As we approach the conclusion of our exploration into Zipporah's fate, we must acknowledge that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved. Some questions are designed to provoke ongoing reflection rather than provide definitive answers. The silence surrounding her ultimate destiny might be less about gaps in historical knowledge and more about the nature of faith itself, which often requires us to trust in purposes we can't fully see and to find meaning in stories that don't always provide the closure we desire. But there's one final dimension to this mystery that we haven't fully explored, one that takes us beyond speculation about what might have happened to Zipporah and into questions about why her story matters for us today. Because ultimately, the significance of her life and the mystery of her disappearance aren't just historical curiosities, but spiritual challenges that speak directly to the choices we face in our own relationships with God and with those He has called for purposes larger than our understanding. The woman who married Moses in the wilderness and saved his life at the crucial moment stands as a testament to the hidden heroes of faith, those whose contributions make possible the great movements of God in human history, but who rarely receive the recognition they deserve. Her story reminds us that behind every significant calling, every important ministry, every divine purpose, there are people whose sacrifices and support make success possible, even when they never appear in the headlines or history books. In our celebrity-obsessed culture, where visibility is often confused with significance and recognition is equated with value, Zipporah's mysterious fate offers a different perspective on what truly matters. Her influence on Moses and on the formation of Israel was crucial, but it didn't depend on continued public acknowledgement or permanent historical documentation. Her worth wasn't diminished by her disappearance from the narrative, because her contributions were woven into the fabric of God's purposes in ways that transcended individual recognition. This has profound implications for how we understand our own roles in God's unfolding plan. Not all of us are called to be Moses, standing before Pharaoh and leading nations out of bondage, but all of us have opportunities to be like Zipporah, acting decisively when crucial moments arise, supporting those whom God has called for significant purposes, and serving faithfully even when our contributions aren't publicly acknowledged or historically recorded. Her story also challenges us to reconsider how we measure the success and significance of our relationships. In a world that often values relationships primarily for what they can do for us personally, Zipporah's example suggests a different standard. Her love for Moses found expression not just in personal happiness and family stability, but in her willingness to do whatever was necessary to ensure the success of his calling, even when that required personal sacrifice. This doesn't mean that all relationships should be subordinated to individual callings or that personal happiness doesn't matter to God, but it does suggest that the highest forms of love sometimes require us to think beyond our immediate desires and consider the larger purposes that God might be accomplishing through the people we love. It challenges us to ask not just what our relationships can do for us, but what we can do through our relationships to serve God's purposes in the world. The mystery of what happened to Zipporah after the Exodus also serves as a reminder that not all stories have endings that satisfy our curiosity or meet our expectations for narrative closure. Life itself is often like this, filled with relationships that don't resolve neatly, with people who impact us profoundly and then move beyond our sphere of knowledge, with questions that remain unanswered despite our best efforts to understand. Faith requires us to find peace with this kind of uncertainty, to trust that God's purposes are being accomplished even when we can't see the complete picture. Zipporah's disappearance from the biblical narrative might be designed to teach us exactly this lesson, to help us develop the kind of trust that can rest in God's faithfulness, even when human stories seem incomplete or unsatisfying. Her example also speaks to the countless individuals throughout history who have served God faithfully in hidden places, whose contributions have been essential to the advancement of His kingdom, but whose names we'll never know. Every great revival has been supported by people who prayed in secret, who gave sacrificially, who served without recognition. Every significant ministry has been made possible by those who work behind the scenes, who handled the practical details, who provided the emotional and spiritual support that enabled public servants to fulfill their callings. Zipporah represents all of these hidden servants, all of these unnamed contributors, all of these faithful supporters, whose work makes possible the visible achievements that capture historical attention. Her story reminds us that God's kingdom advances not just through the efforts of prominent leaders, but through the combined faithfulness of countless individuals who serve in ways that rarely receive public acknowledgement. This perspective transforms how we view our own opportunities for service and sacrifice. We don't all need to be center stage to make significant contributions to God's purposes. We don't all need to have our names remembered by history to have our lives matter eternally. We simply need to be faithful in whatever roles God assigns us, whether those roles are visible or hidden, temporary or permanent, recognized or anonymous. The woman who saved Moses' life and then disappeared into mystery stands as a powerful reminder that God sees and values faithfulness wherever it's found, that significance isn't determined by visibility, and that the most important contributions to His purposes are often made by people whose names we'll never know, but whose faithfulness changes the course of history in ways that echo through eternity. Her legacy challenges each of us to consider what we're willing to sacrifice for the sake of God's purposes, how we can support those He has called for significant ministries, and whether we're prepared to serve faithfully even when that service requires us to step back from recognition and allow others to receive the credit. These are the questions that Zipporah's mysterious fate leaves us with, questions that can transform not just how we understand biblical history, but how we live our own lives in response to God's calling. As we conclude our journey into this ancient mystery, we must acknowledge that the silence surrounding Zipporah's ultimate fate might itself be the most important part of her story. In a world obsessed with having all the answers, with tying up every loose end, with explaining every mystery, her disappearance reminds us that faith sometimes requires us to trust in purposes we can't fully understand, and to find peace with questions that don't have easy answers. The woman who married a shepherd and found herself wed to history's greatest deliverer, who saved her husband's life through decisive action and then vanished from the narrative at the height of his significance, leaves us with a legacy that transcends the mystery of her fate. She reminds us that love sometimes requires sacrifice, that faithfulness doesn't always receive recognition, and that the most important contributions to God's purposes are often made by people whose stories remain forever hidden in the shadows of eternity. Whether Zipporah's story ended in quiet service among the Midianites, in sacrificial withdrawal from Moses' life, or in some other circumstance we can only imagine, her impact on the foundation of Israel remains undeniable. The woman who recognized Moses' potential when he was nothing more than a fugitive, who married him when he had no prospects beyond tending sheep, who saved his life when divine judgment threatened to end his mission before it began, established a pattern of decisive faith that echoes through the generations. But here's what strikes me as most profound about her mysterious disappearance from Scripture. In a narrative that carefully records the deaths of major figures, that documents the passing of leaders and the transition of authority from one generation to the next, Zipporah simply fades away without explanation. Moses' death is recorded in detail, Aaron's passing is documented, Miriam's death is noted, yet the woman who played such a crucial role in Moses' early calling vanishes from the text as if she never existed. This silence feels intentional, almost protective. It suggests that whatever happened to Zipporah, however her story concluded, it was handled with a kind of sacred discretion that honored her contributions while respecting the privacy of her final years. The biblical authors, guided by divine inspiration, chose to veil her ending in mystery, leaving us with questions that may be more valuable than any answers we could receive. Perhaps this is because Zipporah's true significance lies not in how her story ended, but in how it began, and what it accomplished during those crucial early years of Moses' calling. She represents something essential about the hidden foundation upon which God's great works are built. Behind every Moses, there's often a Zipporah, someone whose faithfulness, wisdom, and decisive action make possible the visible achievements that capture historical attention. Her legacy speaks to every person who has ever loved someone called to purposes larger than personal happiness. It challenges every spouse who has watched their partner's divine calling create distance in their relationship. It encourages every parent who has raised children while their spouse was consumed with ministry responsibilities. It validates every person who has made sacrifices for the sake of another's calling, even when those sacrifices went unrecognized and unappreciated. The mystery of her fate also reminds us that not all spiritual contributions can be measured or documented. Some acts of faith, some moments of decisive action, some sacrifices for the sake of God's purposes, operate in realms that transcend historical record. They matter not because they're remembered by human beings, but because they're known by God, not because they receive public recognition, but because they advance divine purposes in ways that echo through eternity. What emerges from our exploration of Zipporah's story is a deeper understanding of what it means to serve God faithfully in a world that often confuses visibility with significance. Her example suggests that the most important work of the kingdom might be done by people whose names we never learn, whose contributions we never fully appreciate, whose sacrifices we never completely understand. She stands as a testament to the countless individuals throughout history who have acted decisively when everything hung in the balance, who have supported God's chosen servants through their most crucial years, who have stepped back into obscurity when the spotlight needed to shine elsewhere. Her mysterious fate honors all those whose stories remain untold, whose contributions remain unrecognized, whose faithfulness remains known only to the one who sees all and forgets nothing. In the end, perhaps the greatest lesson of Zipporah's disappearance from Scripture is this: our significance in God's eternal purposes isn't determined by whether our names are remembered in history books or our contributions documented in sacred texts. It's determined by our faithfulness in the moments that matter, our willingness to act decisively when divine purposes hang in the balance, and our readiness to love and serve even when that service requires us to step away from recognition and allow others to receive the glory. The woman who saved Moses' life and then vanished into mystery leaves us with a powerful reminder that God's kingdom advances through the combined faithfulness of countless hidden servants, that the most important contributions to his purposes are often made in secret, and that true significance is measured not by visibility, but by obedience to divine calling, whatever form that calling might take. And so we reach the end of our journey into one of Scripture's most haunting mysteries. The woman who married a shepherd and watched him become the deliverer of nations, who saved his life with decisive action when divine judgment threatened everything, who walked beside him through the most extraordinary period in human history, leaves us with more questions than answers. But maybe that's exactly what we need. In our age of instant information and immediate answers, Zipporah's mysterious fate forces us to sit with uncertainty, to wrestle with incomplete narratives, to find meaning in the spaces between what we know and what remains hidden. Her story doesn't tie up neatly with a bow, and perhaps that's the point. What we can say with absolute certainty is this: without Zipporah, there might have been no Exodus. Without her quick thinking and spiritual discernment during that terrifying night when God sought to kill Moses, the entire mission to deliver Israel could have ended before it began. The woman who acted when it mattered most, who recognized what needed to be done when even the great deliverer lay helpless, changed the course of human history with a flint knife and unflinching courage. Whether she spent her final years as a hidden diplomat bridging cultures, as a spiritual teacher preparing hearts for divine truth, as a sacrificial wife who chose her husband's calling over her own happiness, or simply as another casualty of the wilderness years whose passing went unrecorded, her impact on the story of redemption cannot be erased. The silence that surrounds her fate speaks as loudly as any words could about the countless unnamed servants whose faithfulness makes possible the great movements of God in human history. Her legacy challenges every one of us to examine our own lives, our own relationships, our own willingness to act decisively when everything hangs in the balance. It asks uncomfortable questions about what we're prepared to sacrifice for divine purposes, about how we support those called to missions larger than personal happiness, about whether we're ready to serve faithfully, even when that service requires stepping away from recognition. In a world obsessed with fame and visibility, Zipporah reminds us that the most significant contributions to God's kingdom might be made by people whose names never appear in headlines, whose stories never get told, whose sacrifices remain known only to heaven. She stands as a testament to the hidden heroes of faith, the decisive moments that change everything, and the price of loving someone whose destiny belongs to purposes greater than any individual relationship. So as we close this exploration, remember the woman who saved Moses when God's judgment threatened to destroy him. Remember the wife who followed her husband into impossible circumstances because she recognized divine calling when she saw it. Remember the mother who raised the children of the great deliverer while he carried the weight of an entire nation's destiny. And remember this: her story may have disappeared from the biblical narrative, but her impact echoes through every generation that followed. The woman who acted when it mattered most, who loved when it cost everything, who served when no one was watching, left fingerprints on eternity that no amount of historical silence can erase. The mystery of Zipporah's fate isn't a gap in scripture that needs filling. It's a sacred space that honors every hidden servant, every unnamed contributor, every faithful person whose story remains untold, but whose impact on God's purposes will never be forgotten. In her disappearance, we find not absence but presence, not ending but continuation, not tragedy but triumph of a different kind. Her legacy lives on in every person who chooses faithfulness over recognition, sacrifice over comfort, divine purpose over personal preference. The woman who married a shepherd and found herself wed to destiny teaches us that significance isn't measured by visibility, that importance isn't determined by documentation, and that the most crucial contributions to God's kingdom might be made by people whose names we never learn, but whose faithfulness changes everything. This is the untold fate of Zipporah, not forgotten, but transformed into a timeless reminder of what it means to serve God faithfully when the stakes are highest, the cost is greatest, and the recognition is nowhere to be found. Her mystery becomes our invitation to live with the same kind of decisive faith, the same willingness to act when everything depends on it, the same readiness to step into the shadows when divine purposes require it. The woman who saved Moses' life and then vanished into eternity leaves us with the most important lesson of all, that God sees every sacrifice, remembers every act of faithfulness, and honors every person who chooses his purposes over their own recognition. Her story may be shrouded in mystery, but her impact on the story of redemption shines with a light that no amount of historical silence can dim. And perhaps that's the most fitting end to her story. Not an ending at all, but a beginning that continues in every life touched by her example, every person inspired by her courage, every individual who chooses to act decisively when divine purposes hang in the balance. The mystery of what happened to Zipporah becomes the invitation to write our own stories of faithful service, hidden sacrifice, and love that transcends personal recognition. Her fate remains untold, but her legacy lives on forever.